This program is powered by thevirtual.show, making your offline events virtual. Ladies and gentlemen, the host of WEBIT Virtual, Dr. Plamen Russev.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining us from all around the world today. We are absolutely honored and delighted to have another leading media panel with truly phenomenal and leading journalists who you will hear later sharing their thoughts and vision on the future of mobility. Anything from urban mobility to space will be covered by true leaders in the area. And of course, we shall make a very short wrap up of the week so far. Let's not forget that tomorrow we have another special edition with Airbus and with Deloitte. But today we're hosting 4 amazing journalists who shall give you a real view on the future of mobility. Without further ado, let me introduce them one after another. Before that, I see already 4,500 people live with us. Thank you so much. It's fantastic to have you with us. You don't forget to use hashtag WEBIT to ask questions to our attendees in the studio. And here is the first.
Louise Lukas is a tech correspondent for more than 20 years at the Financial Times, with experience in a variety of roles based in London and Asia. These include Asia Tech Correspondent, Asia Lex Writer based in Tokyo, Consumer Industries Editor, and Asia News Editor in Hong Kong.
Louise, thank you for joining us again. Welcome back.
Welcome. Good to be back.
Thank you so much. You have been incremental and absolutely important participant in our first day of the Mobility Week here at WEBIT Virtual, when we were having as our guests the founder and chief pilot of Solar Impulse, who has made 2 round trips around the world, one with a hot balloon and another one with his Solar Impulse solar plane. And with the founder of Lime, the fastest growing in the near past electric bicycles company. So thank you so much for joining back. I would love you to make a wrap up of our discussion, to use it as a base for the upcoming episode on mobility. Allow me to introduce our next panelists, and we will start with this.
Of course, thank you.
Matthew Kendall is chief editor at The Economist Group. He manages telecoms coverage for the industry briefing team and creates worldwide technology and telecoms related content. A key element of his role involves editing reports that provide market sizing information for the telecoms sector in 60 countries.
Matthew, hello and welcome to WEBIT Virtual. We are having you on mute now, but it's virtual thing, so we need to do some.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Thank you. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure to have you with us, Matthew. Previous time we were hosting with you very interesting participants like the founder of Siri and many others talking more about telecoms. But today, your second specialty at The Economist, all around mobility. I very much look forward to hear your thoughts and opinion on the future.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm introducing the next 2 participants.
Dave Mosher is a senior space correspondent at Business Insider. He reports news and features stories about science and technology, with human and robotic spaceflight as the primary focus of his 15-year multimedia career.
Welcome, Dave. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
I really look forward to hear your thoughts on the future of mobility, particularly outside of the planet Earth. I know how closely you follow everything connected to space exploration, and you've been participating in some iconic events from the few past weeks. So I very much look forward to hear your thoughts. We have one more participant, let me announce, and we start our discussion.
Jim Motavalli is an auto columnist at Barron's. He also writes for the New York Times, Media Village, Sierra, Autoblog.com, National Public Radio's Car Talk, and others. Jim has written for many other editions as well, and he is also a contributor to the Environmental Defense Fund publications.
Welcome, Jim. Thank you for joining.
Great to be on. I've been writing quite a bit about how the auto industry is coping with COVID-19, and the effects are many and varied, and we'll get into that.
I'm very grateful for you joining us, and I'm expecting you to share invaluable content with all our thousands of attendees today who switched to WEBIT Virtual to be with us from all around the world. I will know the exact number of countries registered a little bit later. So thank you so much for joining. And I would like to have all of you now in the studio, and to start with Louise as promised. Louise, you were with us at the very beginning with our discussions with Bertrand Piccard and with Brad Bao, who is the founder of Lime. I would like to use your experience with this first event on mobility at WebEd this week to wrap up where we were. We were discussing some very interesting topics, so we can start as a base of our discussion. Thank you so much.
Sure. I guess what was really interesting, what came out of our conversation the other day, is how coronavirus has changed, or has the potential to change, a lot of these newer industries for the better. I think Brad Bao, as you said, the founder of Lime, was talking about how we've seen already people a little bit more spooked getting onto buses or subways, now more keen to cycle to work. I know in London that's a big thing. So he was talking about the advantages there. With Bertrand Piccard, we were talking about how it's a chance for the airline industry, which is obviously a torrid time, to look at reinvesting in the future in more green-friendly technologies, and a chance for the industry to reset.
Absolutely. And you have mentioned the impact, and obviously Lime is a very interesting example, because as we have discussed, they had a valuation of over 2.4 billion. And currently, as it's public, they're raising emergency rounds at a valuation which is almost 6 times lower. So obviously that's a huge impact over the participants in the mobility industry, particularly them as part of the urban mobility. And I would like to address now to all of you that first question: how do you think and what are the possible impacts of COVID over the urban mobility, having in mind that example, but many others?
Well,
Maybe
let me just jump
Matthew
in
here?
quickly.
Yeah.
and say that I think one of the big things is the effect on research money. And when we're talking about autonomy and electric vehicles, they depend on the availability of a lot of money to test autonomous cars in the field and develop efficient batteries, all that kind of thing. The research money has been affected by COVID-19 in a big way. I don't think it means that we're not going to see electric autonomous cars on the road. I think the timetable may be pushed back. And the other thing you have to say is that autonomy was also on somewhat of a plateau before COVID. So getting to the next step is very much dependent on research funding, which is definitely difficult right now.
So what do you expect from that point of view? Matthew, what would be your take on that? Because I absolutely agree with Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about the amount of funding that goes into autonomous vehicles per se. I mean, I know that in some parts of the world they were there have been ongoing trials for various sorts of autonomous cars and autonomous taxis as well, on a pretty limited basis. I think, I mean, I can speak for London, because obviously that's where I'm based, and that's the city I know best. But I think a lot of the discussion around COVID is broadly around the future of public transportation, what happens to active travel, so what effect that has on, walking and cycling rates, and also what happens to shared mobility. So, the likes of Lime and other scooter or e-bike services. And also added to that, whether, how many trips that were undertaken by various modes will be at least temporarily replaced by virtual or remote alternatives, or perhaps into the long term will be permanently replaced. There isn't so much of a conversation around autonomy, although I think that's kind of an ongoing process. I think the really interesting thing for me is particularly the sort of the public transport angle and the active travel angle. So you mentioned earlier that the chief of Lime was talking about more people wanting to walk and cycle. So I think that's definitely true. That's something that we're seeing in various parts of the world, and there is an opportunity there. But the public transport decline, or the levels of public transport decline, it's unclear to me, whether public transport can make itself still financially viable with, massive decreases in ridership, and B, whether there's enough kind of scope in which walking and cycling can replace millions of different public transport trips. So, in London, for example, in mid-March, the decline in public transport usage was about 38% lower. And I think in places like Moscow and Singapore, it was somewhere at 64 to 70%. And I think the real danger with this is, as public transport starts to come back, and people start to go back to work, they start to undertake all manner of different local and longer distance journeys, is we will have some people working from home, but not in all industries, and perhaps in insufficient numbers to affect overall mobility patterns. So I think the danger is in cities that old habits return, people jump into their cars, we exacerbate already pretty severe congestion and air quality problems. And then we have, growth in delivery services, for example, that were already sort of clogging streets in a lot of major cities. So I think there's a real calling here for a really progressive and sustainability focused approach to try and, lock in new mobility patterns. But I think the question of public transport is going to be quite difficult to solve.
And there are even more challenges. I can't agree more with what you're saying. Obviously, people are currently scared because of the social distancing. Obviously, you don't expect you go into a metro, underground, or whatever. But another challenge for public transport is the fact that more and more companies follow the steps of Twitter and Shopify, and basically allowing permanent work from home, not during COVID in general. So they kind of restructure the way they work. So I would like to hear, obviously, Dave's take on the same question, but further, let's see. Many people now try to go out of the cities, but you see that there is one major bottleneck here, and it's the internet speed. Do you think there is a solution for this?
First of all, I just want to say, I think, the panelists are exactly right about this problem we're facing. I would layer on top of that we're seeing an exodus of wealthier people from, say, New York City, where I live, and that's going to have some additional ramifications for public transportation. Without that tax base, or that tax base moving, we even had a story in Business Insider, I think today or yesterday, talking about how some wealthier execs are looking to move to floating islands. It's just a sort of fun example of the exodus I'm talking about here. But that's going to have some adverse effects for people who rely on public transportation to get to work for jobs they physically.
Is this Peter Thiel's project, or you're talking about something else?
I haven't read the story, but I just saw the headline. But suffice it to say, like, there's a lot of people of a wealthier status who are moving out of these cities, and the internet is an issue for them. For the past decade, the United States, and that's where my knowledge base is mainly rooted here, they've been working to bridge the digital divide and lay, countless miles of fiber optic cables, stand up mobile towers, get 5G rolling. And amid all that, we have this sort of last 10%, it's kind of less than that now, of folks who don't have access to broadband internet, the kind of internet you need to stream Netflix or Hulu or whatever you do, video casts like we're doing now, and do any number of other things that you need to do remotely, which is where a lot of these people are moving to and considering moving there permanently because they can do their work digitally, remotely. So amid all that, SpaceX and OneWeb and Telesat and a whole other number of companies are trying to get up fleets of satellites, internet beaming satellites, that will talk to little stations on Earth and help you connect to broadband internet no matter where you are, basically. And those systems haven't totally proven out yet, in particular SpaceX, which is making a lot of big promises. We'll see if they can meet them and qualify for federal subsidies. But that's kind of the way things are moving. And it'll be interesting to see if that gap, along with the wealthy, can bridge a divide for also people who are less fortunate in these remote areas, because by sort of pioneering that the funding of that technology, through these pretty expensive antennas that you need to, phased array antennas that you need to point to these satellites constantly and electronically, that may bring down the cost for other people to get online. So that may help others sort of access markets and participate in the economy in ways that they couldn't before. As for mobility proper, I'll just kind of return to my previous point, which is I'm concerned about public transportation with a lot of folks moving out, but we'll see how many people actually stay. That it may just be, as you said, sort of a temporary fear once a vaccine is presumably developed, or there's some frontline treatments that are proving out. We may see a reduce in fear and people returning to cities.
Dave, could I just add that the fear that has got people out of public transit has also affected shared ride services like Uber and Lyft. And for the same reasons, people don't want to get into a space that may have just been inhabited by somebody else who's possibly infected. And Uber and Lyft have seen dramatic decreases in ridership also, along with public transit. And also, I have a house in Connecticut with broadband that I'd be glad to sell you if you're interested.
I mean, I recently went down to Cape Canaveral, Florida, to watch SpaceX launch its Demo 2 mission, its first ever people, and I was terrified. I flew
first or second.
This is their first ever passenger, so they flew 2 NASA astronauts.
No, I mean, have you been there for the first, which didn't go, or the second, or both?
So I missed the first one because I had some childcare issues, because I'm still working from home in my daughter's bedroom right now. But I was able to catch it after they delayed that launch, since they moved it to a Saturday. But yeah, I was terrified. To speak to those fears, I basically went into a detox for 2 weeks after I got back, because I was afraid of spreading possible COVID to my family.
So that's responsible behavior, isn't it? Yesterday, we were having 3 fantastic startups. One was preparing railways to become hosts of Hyperloop. The second startup was doing the most efficient car in the world. They already have raised 30 million on that and raising more. Having a car on solar batteries and photovoltaic. Very interesting. Third one was doing miracles with planes. So we basically had 3 different types of transportation. I would like to go back to Louise now And Louise, where would you see the other types of transportation having their future and their world now and their future completely changed? We were talking about a little bit about the urban mobility, but what is your take on the rest of means of transport?
I guess what was interesting in the mostly still the urban mobility, but taking it broader. So the idea that I think it was Uber first pioneered it, but this idea of seamless travel. So on your app, you'll work out to get the train from the provinces or whatever into the city, then switch to something else, then perhaps a car to take you to that, a shared car like the Uber or Lyft or whatever, or perhaps a bike to take you that bit, last bit. That is something that I think we're going to have to wait and see if that is going to work. Obviously, you know, as Jim's mentioning, Uber and Lyft have had a lot of problems, people being less keen to use them at the moment. It's also interesting that in markets in Asia, specifically China, that did not pan out as was spoken. So I think it's quite hard to see where things will actually go, though personally, for climate reasons and other, I very much hope the bike idea does pick up, and I do genuinely think that now with the natural aversion to getting into a particularly crowded train or even a bus, that you might find people, certainly around the part of London I'm in now, I look out the window and I do see a lot more people on bikes than previously.
We have nothing yet here on this discussion for airplanes, but maybe I'll leave that to Dave before we jump into the space to talk about that particular. Matthew, what do you think is the solution to the urban mobility challenge as lockdown restrictions is over? What do you think will be the next steps?
I think the really essential thing is I mean, I think a lot of world cities were already on this journey, but I think this has kind of accelerated a need to rethink mobility, and especially thinking about road space reallocation in cities. So, you know, I do think a more concerted effort to pivot towards micro mobility solutions, so, you know, e-scooters, e-bikes, etc., and prioritizing active travel would really help sort of soften the blow to public transport networks. You know, and as I said, a return to cars en masse would, you know, would grind cities to a halt, I think, in a lot of circumstances. And if you have a look at the experience of lockdown, I mean, certainly in Europe, I mean, I don't know about elsewhere, but air quality improved in several European cities
dramatically,
by about 40 to 50%. Now, air quality was already pretty high up on the agenda in Europe in general because of, you know, the Volkswagen diesel scandal, and, you know, the fact that we have quite a lot of diesel pollution in Europe, and the sort of momentum around climate change as well has sort of really put air quality high up on the editorial agenda. I think there are also challenges around physical activity and mental health during lockdown as well. So physical activity dropped by something like 40% in early April in Spain. There was a 20% rise in domestic violence. You know, there are possibly longer term mental health impacts of reduced contact and periods of confinement. And that will, you know, potentially be the case even with lockdown restrictions easing and potentially more people working from home, or not necessarily undertaking long commutes, but you know, having to work from home or undertake local journeys for various different reasons. So I think all this kind of underscores the need to rethink public space, or even just to create more of it through various kind of pedestrianization schemes and what have you. And to some extent, cities are already doing this. I mean, Paris has quite an ambitious plan of Corona cycleways that they want to build. They've built 50 kilometers of it already, and some of these actually map onto existing subway lines. So it's a way of trying to replicate that subway service in a way that actually moves people in an efficient manner. Milan has a similar kind of plan, you know, transforming about 35 kilometers of streets in the city centre. Bogota, New York. I mean, there are loads of different cities around the world that have already started to roll out temporary infrastructure for walking and cycling, and that is absolutely something that cities should be thinking about very seriously, or should be enacting already. But I think there's still a big question over public transport, and I say that because, again, in London, because this is my own personal experience, but transport for London here, the Transport Authority, we're talking about shifting about 8 million journeys onto other modes of travel. And with trains and buses having to operate at about 1/5 of their capacity because of social distancing, there's still a lot of, an awful lot of trips that have to be absorbed by other means, even if we take into account a big shift to walking and cycling, even if we account for a big shift towards working from home. There's still a lot of people that need to get to where they work, and might have to travel long distances, particularly from the suburbs. So I think there's a big question now over what is the future funding model for public transport. Will it involve, more state intervention and more subsidies? There's a question around the sustainability of different public transport services. Now, obviously, that depends on how long, COVID continues to undermine our ability to move around freely. So, it depends on, how effective treatments are, whether we find a vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. But if this is to be something that we have to tolerate for, the next year or couple of years, then, there's some really serious questions around how we actually provide and fund public transport.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's obviously public transport is going to be rethought, and we need to rethink it through a couple of perspectives. Public transport is one of the biggest polluters, and also public transport is one of the reasons for the need of road renovations, because it's heavier, and et cetera, et cetera. So obviously, COVID maybe will bring a new solution. And it was just the start of the rollout of electric cars, and autonomous kind of started. So how did COVID-19 affected those, Jim?
Well, I think it's been a big delaying factor. I think both autonomy and the electrification of the world, both of which I think are inevitable, have been delayed. And it's unclear exactly how much, but I would say at least a year or two. I mean, maybe it's not an enormous effect. I do think all the automakers are still undeterred for switching to electric. I just saw that Lyft announced that it's going to switch to an all-electric fleet, which is kind of an interesting thing because Lyft doesn't even own its cars. It's basically telling its operators that they have to operate electrically. They have to buy electric cars. But I do think we're moving towards a possible future in which people will no longer own cars. Cars will be shared. I wrote about this for the New York Times a few weeks ago. And there's a lot of benefits to this. I think Matthew got into this earlier, that we could possibly free up a lot of urban space currently devoted to parking, because cars sit idle for 95% of the time. If you had them operating like robo-taxis, essentially on the road all the time, then we need probably a car park that's a third the size. So that's a huge advantage in terms of urban infrastructure in being able to reduce parking and turning streets back to people and all that. And it's happening at the same time that European cities are closing inner cities to cars, at least gasoline powered or diesel powered cars. So I think that's a trend. We're going to definitely get internal combustion out of cities around the world. But there's powerful pushback from forces who say, we've always owned cars. We're going to own them. We're going to own these autonomous cars also. The automakers are pretty much split on this. And the auto industry as a whole, if you look at it, what's happening right now, it's basically.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you actually, will the future
back.
of shared driving be owned cars or rented cars, hired cars?
I think partly because of environmental reasons, I think we're going to go to the shared model. But in the New York Times piece that I wrote, I have both sides represented and there's strong opinion on either way. But actually, if we had private ownership model, it would actually lead to more travel, more pollution, and it doesn't become, autonomy does not become a positive force at that point. There'll be more travel. Kids and older people will be driving when they wouldn't have been before. So vehicle miles traveled would actually increase in a private ownership model.
I think shared also makes sense just from a financial perspective as well, doesn't it? Because there's all sorts of costs incurred when you actually own the vehicle and you have to maintain it and pay, all sorts of fees for various, various elements of taxation to actually keep having it on the road. And I think that can, for certain groups of people, that can be quite a drain on personal finances. So again, the shared model kind of makes sense that you use it as and when you need it, rather than having, this sort of deteriorating asset that's kind of out on the street that you have to constantly, pay money for to ensure that it keeps going for the odd occasions when you might actually use it.
That it's you use your car only 4% of the time you own it. That's quite weird. That's the statistics. So you basically
consider the shift. If you take a company like Uber, right now the cars are owned by the operators, and that has obvious benefits for Uber. But is it going to buy huge fleets of autonomous electric vehicles and suddenly become a fleet operator? Will it then instead lease these vehicles from a third party? Will auto companies become essentially partners with shared mobility companies and become suppliers? Will auto branding virtually disappear? All those questions are up for grabs, really.
I actually have a confession to make, and that is I own a car, and I'm subject to all these things you guys just talked about. It's sitting around for most of the time. I've been trying to convince my wife to get rid of it so that we can move to ride sharing most of the time. We do have some practical challenges though, which is you have 2 kids under 4 and they need car seats. Jim, I was actually curious, or maybe Matthew, or anyone really, like, how do you see these practical hurdles, getting over them? And also, here in the United States, cars are sort of a rite of passage, almost as beloved as firearms. I'm kind of curious to see if you see that hurdle being surmounted. And
Dave, your generation is supposedly less interested in owning cars, though you're sort of defying that by actually owning one. But one of the working assumptions is that millennials and people beyond that will not be all that interested in owning a car. I'm not sure if that really works, because cars do offer a lot of advantages owning one. I mean, would you be comfortable just sharing a car and no longer owning one?
I mean, we are already sharing our car with some friends of ours down the hallway, so we're sort of forcing a shared model. And this is a hand-me-down car. I pledged in a Popular Science op-ed, I think in 2014 or 2015, why you can't sell me a car. And I totally buy into this perspective as a sort of older millennial. I think that's what you call me. That I would rather have the car drive me. I'd rather not drive. I'd rather not worry about parking it. Those are definitely concerns I have. But yeah, like in this, it's interesting how this pandemic is sort of forcing a very big shift in transportation and mobility. And I think it's got a lot of people rethinking their futures. And here in New York City, for example, we're closing down a lot of streets from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. You're supposed to go 5 miles an hour through them. So the streets have turned into big block parties. And that's been fascinating to watch. And so I wonder what sorts of downstream ramifications there'll be for things like that in terms of car ownership. Maybe people will be less cling less to their cars and be willing to go with some alternative mode.
A lot of the long-term trends that were in place before COVID are still in place. And I actually be curious to know, Louise, do you think we're going to have shared autonomous cars or privately owned?
I think it's quite interesting listening to you two, because obviously, like you say, in America, a car is very much a rite of passage. I don't think Europe's ever had just quite that same thing. And also perhaps it is more expensive with all the various taxes and everything. So I think certainly in the big cities, I mean, it's absolutely been the case that Uber was seen as a huge thing. And also the zip cars as well, where you can just find the nearest car to you, open it up with your phone, go in and use it if you need to go somewhere slightly further. So to me, it would seem very much something that this is now shared as the way to go. What interests me, Jim, and you sort of alluded to it, is what happens to car makers if your whole thing is a brand and we no longer want the status symbol of saying, I own a Mercedes, I own this. What then happens if you are a company with a brand? How do you then monetize that in a shared economy world?
That's actually leading to my next question to all of you. And that's what I like about the Leading Media Forum every week. I'm almost not needed. It goes easy. So what kind of strategies do you think that cities need to implement in their post-COVID strategies? Because obviously a lot of things will change. We still haven't discussed the details of the next step. So that's where I want to bring you. Obviously, not very easy days for the car makers. At the same time, we will see, and we already see, huge change in the public transportation. So obviously, cities need to think their mobility planning and strategies. And mobility and transportation is the blood system of every city. So what do you expect that cities will, or actually first should, and they will do? Matthew?
So just to sort of give my response on what we were just saying now about potential obstacles to car ownership, and this sort of ties into what I think the future strategy should be for a lot of cities. I think one of the key elements in terms of the obstacles we were talking about is really about density. And making sure that there is enough density in neighborhoods within cities to ensure that there are all manner of different services within walking or cycling distance. And I think that's when you start to see car ownership become less of a necessity. I think it's fair to say probably in most cities, the inner cores are probably quite walkable, quite dense, and then car ownership sort of starts to increase as you move out further out from the center. So
we are turning the cities into parks in regards of the highways. Highways should become walking ways and parks.
Potentially. I mean, it depends on the circumstance. I mean, clearly, we are going to have some degree of cars within cities, as that they are useful for certain trips. But I think if you look at what Paris is doing, I mean, they're rolling out all these Corona pop-up cycleways, but they've also, the mayor there has posited this idea of the 15-minute city, which isn't terribly sort of revolutionary necessarily, but just this idea that a certain level of density sort of encourages a local economy. And so if you have more services within a 15-minute walk or 15-minute cycle, you don't then have to undertake the longer trips, which would put pressure on public transport or for which you might actually have to use a car. So I think if COVID is this this health crisis that we're going to have to put up with for a really sustained period of time, then if we do have more flexible working, if we do have staggered work times or staggered commute times, and we have people spending longer in their local neighborhoods and undertaking more varied journeys, then I think cities need to start thinking about how to nurture those local economies, how to use local street space to ensure that all manner of different people can get around at different times of the day. and you know, and also, you know, recognizing that more local trips, you know, also perhaps means citizens relying on more local supply chains as well. I think the really interesting thing here is, I mean, we're in the middle of a health pandemic. I think one of the really overlooked aspects of kind of city and urban planning has been actually combining health with urban planning. So recognizing that there is some degree to which we can design city space, plan city space, in order to actually improve health outcomes, not just for the city as a whole, but also for you know, different socioeconomic groups. So, for instance,
The thing that the city could do would be to defund public transit because of low ridership. Getting back to funding for public transit, it never pays for itself on a fair basis. You can't actually subsidize subways just by having people pay fares and having that. It's never actually worked. It's never worked for train travel at all. Having people pay fares and having that. That's never actually worked. It's never worked for train travel at all. And I do think we're going to see an end to important than ever in going forward there. So the worst thing we could do was decide we don't need public transit because nobody's riding it right now. And I do think the cities are moving away from cars. Even though I'm a car writer, I'd like to see fewer cars in the cities. New York has 1 million cars a day entering it. I think that's too many. Of course, it's probably not true right now. But
Jim, you're
day,
called a green auto columnist, right? Writing Wheels for 25 years, also editor of 9 books. So I know that this topic is very close to your heart, and from that perspective, we talk about cities now. So how do you perceive this general green living concept? And I will go after this to Dave and to Louise, based on you know, taking their point of view on that. But what is yours?
Well, I've written 2 books about electric cars, and I think the industry is moving towards that, in part because of climate change regulations, particularly in Europe. The U.S. has moved a little bit backwards in that area, but in Europe, those regulations are very much affecting automakers around the world. They're all global automakers. They don't just sell cars in the U.S. or just in Europe. Yep. So they're affected when Europe has tough regulations, China has tough regulations. It doesn't really matter that the U.S. has weak ones. They still have to comply. And virtually every automaker in the world is moving towards an electric future. You have companies like Volvo that say pretty much all of their cars will soon be electrified. That includes plug-in hybrids. I don't think there's an automaker in the world that is not either planning an electric car or has already introduced them. And this includes companies you would never think that would be in this field, like Ferrari, Lamborghini, you know, McLaren. These are companies that are all looking at electrification. We even have electric car racing in the form of Formula E, which is also a global thing. It's Absolutely. A phenomena. Maybe right now, no one would be watching the races, but we would definitely. I think it's caught on. I think people are getting excited about it, and this is a big way that I think the car will be taken out of the environmental equation. That and sharing and reducing the fleet by 50 or 60%. I think it will greatly impact greatly reduce the auto industry's impact on climate. So
why don't we speak about hydrogen?
My first book looked a lot at fuel cell cars, and I've actually owned the domain fuelcellcars.com, and I've written a lot about them. Right now, I think electric mobility is moving so much quicker that I don't think hydrogen is going to be the fuel of the future. And one of the big advantages of fuel cell cars is they had bigger range, but electric cars have pretty much addressed that. So you can buy 300-mile range or 400-mile range Teslas, and a lot of other companies like Lucid are going in that direction. So I don't think the advantage of hydrogen is there.
I hear you. And Dave, to you, we were following the discussion on moving out of the cities, which obviously will also further change because of the behavioral change of the people, will change the model of the transportation mobility within the cities. And there are these few factors, and we've discussed about internet, and Elon Musk has recently said that connecting to all the satellites in his invention is the Starlink is something that will take years, but then internet will be everywhere. How do you think this will change the way we live?
Sure. I just want to springboard off Jim's comment first about the hydrogen fuel cells. That speaking of Elon Musk, he's exasperatingly sort of railed against them for many years. And his point, which I think is well taken, is that it takes a lot of energy just to split water and store hydrogen in a fuel cell. And by the time you do all that, you might as well just plug the thing into an outlet, as an electric vehicle. So I found that sort of interesting. And as for, Starlink's, so Starlink is the mega fleet, which not really a correct term, but it's a large constellation of internet satellites that are increasingly going up. There's, I think 540 of them now. And they're planning to launch SpaceX alone. They're not the only company that's trying to do this, but SpaceX alone is planning to launch, about 60 of these at a time every 2 weeks until they get to about 800 to 1,000 satellites, which will give them a constellation or a fleet that would be able to support public service. And they're planning a beta of that service this summer. What is interesting to me, even though the chief operating officer and president, Gwen Shotwell, said that, they're looking to start that service by the end of this year, is that Musk admitted to Aviation Week that the way you talk to the satellite through a user terminal is not really there yet in terms of cost. These phased array antennas, which can instantly switch from one satellite to another, so you have a almost seamless internet connection in terms of your backhaul, they are expensive. They're $1,500, $2,000 a pop. And Musk has been talking about bringing them down to a cost of about $200 to make them affordable. We have yet to see that. And he said it could take a few years to do that. So I'm really interested to see how SpaceX, as it spends probably, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in capital launching the satellites, makes up for that gap. They've got other things cooking, of course, a fully reusable launch vehicle, which could dramatically reduce the cost of access to space if it works. And that's a big if, but I'm interested. You can't rule them out. I can't write them off. And so I'm really curious to see how these constellations, again, Amazon is planning, one of about 3,700 satellites. SpaceX's, by the way, they're authorized for about 12,000 in the United States, at least, and with plans possibly for 42,000, which is 8 times more than all the spacecraft ever launched by humanity since the dawn of the space age, which is absolutely nuts.
What a number. Wow.
Yeah, it's a mind-boggling number. And they're just one of several providers trying to do this. Not all of them will survive. We saw OneWeb enter Chapter 11 restructuring recently. But I'm really curious to see how this would change the game. Like, if I knew I could move to the middle of the woods and have internet and be able to do my job, I might do that. If my career was allowed for it, my family situation did, where you don't have broadband, in the middle of North Dakota or South Dakota or Montana. These are like wild landscapes. So, I can't really make any predictions here. Another thing I wanted to say, though, is that, in New York City, I think there might be like a sort of, a silver lining to this whole pandemic. And I was kind of getting at this before, and that is people are being forced to rethink how they're living. And I grew up in kind of a small town in Ohio, and I love my mom and pop shops. I love going to the record store and the local, ice cream parlor and all that. Those went away as the world became more globalized and I grew up. And I'm seeing a sort of resurgence of that here. I'm seeing people without any storefronts at all start to pop up their own businesses because people are really locked into their locations. And I would love, and maybe Matthew has some numbers on this or some crystal balling predictions, but I'd love to see how the economy might be shifting into a more localized model where we're seeing a resurgence in these kind of local businesses away from, you know, the mega corporations. And I think part of the thing that's driving that too is a lack of mobility for shipping. I mean, we've seen Amazon's, you know, guaranteed 1 or 2 day shipping services here in the United States just fall away. And we're looking at sometimes a week or 2 weeks to get something you need. So people are really leaning on their local economies. And I'd love to see the economic and mobility data on that, and, you know, how many new businesses are being formed. I think that's a very interesting time. And amid all that, of course, we have, you know, a coming improvement in internet in some form, possibly from space, through SpaceX or OneWeb or Iridium or whoever it may be. So it's a really interesting time. I think it's a shifting time, and the pandemic has forced a lot of that. This is mostly observational and anecdotal, but maybe the smarter people in the room can weigh in on those things.
Dave, hasn't there been kind of a?
You guys,
hasn't there been
such a? Yeah, sorry, Jim. I wanted to go back to the Louise, just to hear your opinion, Louise, on the new strategies that the cities have to make. We are recently going to be having the WEBIT Impact Global gathering, which will be replacing our annual in-person gathering. It will be in October. And we are bringing a lot of mayors, a lot of prime ministers, etc., all together, of course, with all innovators from all around the world. So what will be your take on the new strategies based on what we discussed the cities need to undertake?
Well, I think one of the things that is really interesting is that, as with a lot of things, there's going to have to be a new set of rules of engagement. I mean, we've seen a lot of these companies, and possibly Uber more than any, getting into quite fraught situations, not just in San Francisco and in different parts of the US, but almost everywhere they've gone. They've butted up against either local taxi lobby being too strong. We've seen that in Japan, for example, or they've come up against competitors. Either way, there's always been a feeling, certainly from their side, mayors, councils, town councils, cities, they're just, you know, they don't want to even get down and start talking with us. The incumbents are too strong a lobby. I think it will be interesting because, as everyone's been discussing, they will have to be part of the solution. Will this now mean that, just as in, you know, in some cities we've seen more bike lanes, does it mean that governments, city councillors will be more willing to sit down and have these conversations? That's one thing they'd be willing to, but under that comes obviously a whole shoal of things that have to be discussed as well. Exactly what is the situation with insurance? What does happen, as we've seen, you know, mainly in Asia, but we've certainly seen in Europe as well, and I'm sure the US, where you've had attacks on passengers in cars. What happens then? Gig workers, how do we treat gig workers? We've always sort of thought, well, you know, isn't it fantastic if you're a student or something, you can work for Deliveroo for a bit, or you can be an Uber driver for a bit. The reality, of course, which has been made even more evident during this pandemic, is that people are relying on these companies as their sole source of income. They've got no health insurance in the US. You know, what do you do when you can't work if you're sick? So I think these are all the kind of things that come under that, the sort of more, I guess, social responsibility type thing that towns, cities are going to have to thinking about. And it's all on a very patchwork basis, because we're not saying, what does the US think? What does Europe think? You're really honing down, not even what does, you know, New York think, but what's going to be the view in Manhattan. So I think there's going to have to be an awful lot of discussions and really 3D thinking through, you know, as I say, go through each part of it.
We'll see huge changes. And I'm not sure if you're aware, I'm not sure if this is public, but there are already 30 countries rolling a strategy on UBI, Universal Basic Income. And that is additionally going to change the way people commute, the way people move from place to place. In Europe, the first country is Spain, but there are 13 total, and the number is growing. All this coordinated by UN. So this will be another driving agent of changes in mobility in the cities, and nobody knows how this will grow. So far, this is a program for post-COVID recovery, but who knows how will this go and how this will affect the liberal democracy in general. So we'll be talking about it. We have to wrap up. It's terrible. We have only 1 hour and so much to talk about. And I would like to hear Dave's take on when we are going to space for good, maybe. But I would like to have Dave, you very quickly here with me in the studio to reflect on. You were recently working on stories covering also launching of SpaceX, rocketing's first NASA astronaut to space for a while, as we've started in the beginning. Your latest work, recently, actually published yesterday, is about SpaceX building a floating super heavy class spaceports for its Starship rocket to reach to the moon, to the Mars, fly passengers around Earth. So please share just briefly. I mean, it's not fair, briefly, but
I mean, it's a really crazy time to be alive. That's the summary. We're gonna see some really, if all this stuff works out, and that's a big if, we could see some really, speaking of mobility, some really rapid shifts in that. I mean, I was at a conference in January in DC where a SpaceX executive basically said, we're kind of looking to upend the entire long-haul airline industry with this rocket ship. And I published a story, and readers were kind of like, they thought it was a joke, when I said that SpaceX wants to launch, to do 15 million, long-haul flights a day or something like that with the Starship rocket. It's kind of nuts, but if they can get it to work, they're going to dramatically reduce the cost of access to space. And we're talking 1,000, maybe 10,000 fold by making the vehicle fully reusable and robust. You don't have to replace any parts. Traditional rockets, I
cannot even comprehend the numbers, honestly speaking.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. I'm super skeptical, frankly. I'll believe it when I see it. But in the meantime, you've got all these other startups happening too. Like just before this conference, or the session, a company came out of hiding called Space Perspective, and they're going to be launching people toward the edge of space at the end of a giant hydrogen balloon. So if you want to take in the curvature of Earth and see things, you can do that. We have Virgin Galactic, which is the only public space transportation company. They're pursuing high-speed travel as well. There are interesting environmental sustainability issues in all of this. For example, Elon Musk is basically claiming with SpaceX that in its Starship vehicle, this 39-story behemoth rocket, will be almost carbon neutral because they're going to complex methane from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere using solar energy or wind energy or whatever renewable resource. We'll see if that happens. We're talking about basically 9 million pounds of fuel per launch, which is a lot of fuel. And if that methane leaks out, then we have a very potent greenhouse contributor. So it'll be really interesting just to see how all this evolves. And there's definitely got to be some some regulations coming, and the government agencies are still trying to catch up, keep up with SpaceX and some of these other startups. It's just a really interesting time to be alive and covering this beat as we look at disruption in multiple forms. We'll see if it happens. This might not work out, but it'll be fun to tell the grandkids about it for sure.
Thank you so much for all of you for being here with us. And Louise, let's keep the tradition. We've opened together with you, and you've been with us almost through this week. We have one more event tomorrow, but what would be your wrap up of today's discussion and previous discussion we had this week on mobility?
I think it might be easier for me to get to space in a few years than to get than to buy a private car, is what I think.
Isn't it weird?
Very weird, yes.
Elon Musk is ready to sell you a ticket to Mars for the price of a house. So if you want to go,
Might just save up a bit longer.
I think it's fascinating that Elon seems to be, I think he considers himself sort of vaguely above the law, which is what we saw when he was ordered to keep his Tesla factory closed. I mean, he doesn't like to be told no. That's definitely the case.
Or by the SEC either, let's face it.
Or by anybody. for anything.
Gosh, I don't want this this event to finish, but unfortunately it has to. Promise me all of you are coming back again.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Sure.
With Jim is very easy. He's coming up tomorrow with us. So thank you all. Thank you all for being with us. It was for me, it was a great experience to host you, to hear your thoughts. I feel I am through 3-4 years ahead of time now, and I see your vision and your dreams on the future of the city of mobility. And definitely it looks cleaner, and definitely it looks shared, and definitely it will be electric. So saying this, I feel so sorry for two of the startups I was almost going to invest into. They were having pods that were very autonomous, and at the same time they were connecting and building something like a train structure, and then they detaching, going different directions, then attaching again. Quite interesting concept. Unfortunately, two of them did not make it. So as an investor, I feel great for not putting my money on fire. But on the other side, from what you say, I just think their time is coming up next, in the next few years, maybe. Thank you all again for being with us. Announcing here our tomorrow's event. It's a special event tomorrow. So please join us again. I know that Friday is not the usual time when you are joining us, but tomorrow we are hosting Dr. Sandra Schaffer, who is head of Airbus Group Demonstration and CEO of Airbus, up next. And we have Scott Carwin, who is a global leader, future of mobility at Deloitte. It will be a fantastic discussion, and I look forward to welcome back here with us Jim, who will help me moderate, and he will be in the position asking questions and representing you, the audience, and of course himself. Thank you so much for being with us. See you tomorrow. For those who will not watch WEBIT Virtual tomorrow, we are heading in a fantastic digital entertainment and media week next week with truly phenomenal participants. Check virtual.webit.org for more information and sign up to watch our free online events virtually. Thank you all, and see you tomorrow.
This program is powered by the Virtual.show, making your offline events virtual.